My name is Dr. Austin Tay, and you are listening to Psych Chat. Hi there. Welcome to episode 11 of Psych Chat. In this episode, I spoke with James Morley-Kirk of China Select. James is a business psychologist who was based in Shanghai but now in Malaysia. He shared with me his experience working as a business psychologist in Shanghai and also talked about his psychometric tool TD12. I hope you enjoy this episode. If you have any comments or suggestions, please send them to psychchat@omnisci.com or tweet to psych_chat. This podcast is brought to you by Omnisci Consulting. I am very delighted to be joined by James Morley-Kirk from China Select. Hi, James.
Good morning, Austin.
How are you today?
Really good, thank you.
Good. Perhaps you could kind of explain or rather introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, delighted. My name is James Morley-Kirk. I'm a British psychologist. I've specialized in organizational psychology, but particularly talent assessment for the last 13, 14 years. I run a company called China Select, based up in Shanghai, where we've been since 2006, helping folks with assessing capabilities and potential of future and current employees. I'm currently actually based in Malaysia. So it's a sunny day, even with a lockdown. Yeah, that's pretty much my background. I think I've got some other stories before that, but I'll keep those for the time being.
I'm sure our listeners will be very delighted to hear those stories. We will get to that as we progress in the podcast itself. Looking at your background, you have a very colorful background. I mean, from where you first started. I mean, you didn't start it out as a psychologist. You kind of gravitate to that.
Yeah,
a bit more on that side.
I like the idea. I think that organizational or business psychologists are not pure academics because, we're applied scientists, so one has to understand the area that you're applying your science to. And so actually, my sort of career paths, multiple paths, started off in the British Army. I got a scholarship to Sandhurst when I was just a young boy, and did some time with the UK Armed Forces in technology and Royal Signals communications. So plenty of time with helicopters and big green things, which was great, of course. And then that takes its time. And then I was so fortunate to join the Swire Group. And joined Swire in Hong Kong, was seconded to Cathay Pacific as one of their executive trainees, and I stayed with Cathay for 8 years, and that obviously you can imagine is a fabulous experience. A wonderful company with superb people, and the experiences of living and working around the world is something that I actually got with the British Army as well. My first job was in Cyprus. So I've always been blessed with the satisfaction of my own curiosity to live around the planet. And that then continued further after I left Swire around the 1999, 2000. And I went to Beijing to study Chinese for about 6 months to really embed my link to Asia. And then after that, I actually was back in the UK for a short time, involved with the internet, startups and bubbles, which was just an extraordinary period of growth and learning. And then decided to hit the brakes and go back to university again. I got my master's in Org Psych at the University of Nottingham. And the moment I'd finished my master's, I flipped back to China, to Shanghai. And I went to Shanghai rather than Beijing because I'd been to Beijing. So literally just following more curiosity. And then I worked for a leadership development company called IWNC. Lots of fun and games with them because it was experiential learning. And that took me right around China, working with some amazing companies, developing their leadership teams and their individual leaders through experiential learning, group interventions and coaching. And it was then just that pure pull of psychometrics really that is the foundation of what Org Psychs do, our assessment capability, that drove me to set up China Select back in 2006. So yeah, a bit of a journey, and now of course that journey continues here in Malaysia, where I've just finished a teaching engagement with the University of Reading here on some psychology courses, which has been again a wonderful experience.
Yes, and I mean, it's such a long journey that you have shared with us. I'm sure you will continue doing what you are good at, even when you're based in, now that you're based in Malaysia. Now, I'm very curious, what really attracted you to set up in China? Because you had experience in Hong Kong, and you were in China for a while. What were the reasons for you to set up in China? Was there, immediate interest that Chinese market was actually opening up? Because at that period of time when we were looking at assessment work and development work, Hong Kong and China, comparing both countries, Hong Kong has always been more on the forefront of assessment, embracing those work, whereas China was still kind of a exploratory stage. Was it the reason why you decided to start in China?
Of course, they're the same country now, as we know.
Yes. Yes.
And yet, you're quite right. Still, they were very different, and still are in some ways different economic and legal environments. And one of the challenges with setting up the business in China is that risk. Actually, there's entrepreneurially, there's a couple of things. The risk, the legal risk of doing so, and then it was much more risky. It's probably the easiest way to say that. In setting up a business then, because you couldn't actually be a direct shareholder. So it's very much, that sort of approach was very much against, if you like, overseas investment and investors. But the real reason I think that drove me is because I saw the need. At that time, the people's understanding of those people that I would meet, understanding of organizational psychology, their understanding of assessing systematically, fairly, evaluating people in a standard way, with respect for them, so as not to harm them unintentionally or intentionally through the process or the outcome. It was just a very poor environment. And given that the country had so much potential, of course, so many people who were being hired or developed, which I'd seen face to face, the assessments that were being used, as China does have a long history of assessing people, right back to the government imperial exams, and massive testing, of course, to go into school and go to university. I mean, they would test for hours. Sometimes to join a company, they just create tests that were it wasn't the content, it was how long it took and how many people they could put into a room at the same time because it looked so impressive, and they were renjenda, they were being serious about it. It had nothing to do with what they were trying to predict. And it was obvious that, even based upon my knowledge at that time, that with the connections and the global standards of psychometrics at the time, that it's possible to provide something. And I'd already, been talking with various suppliers back in the UK during my master's degree, because of course I wasn't a normal student. I was very business aware and was making, like we said a bit earlier, about making connections with people who might have solutions. And so through a series of conversations, I had a supplier who could help and was interested with an online platform, and we could set up a server in China relatively quickly. And I found sufficient local contacts to make me come, and that's what we did. So it was just that, here's the opportunity, there's a need, there is some value we can do, let's give it a shot.
You were talking about how you actually set it up in China, and that was very, very early stage of the 2000s. I'm sure you might have actually encountered a lot of different issues setting up, and also how do you go about actually finding clients? Because as you just said, China is a big country. However, the experience or the knowledge of assessment is still quite rudimentary. How do you encourage, or how do you actually identify potential clients and convince them that is the right way to do it?
Yeah, it's just a great question, because at one level, in a typical entrepreneurial way, you scan the environment, you check in with people, and you realize, oh my goodness, yes, there's a real need for this, and so away you go, because rationally this just makes all sense. And then of course, to get somebody to change their behavior, to change the way they think about talent, about people, about assessment, which will require some investment in time or effort, or even in some cases paradigm shifts. And within the organizational structures and control structures of these organizations, the boss's attitude, the boss likes, he likes blood type, he likes horoscopes, he doesn't believe in, and you come across a lot of this, we don't believe in personality assessment based upon, I don't know, whatever they feel is based upon. And so you're absolutely right. To go from idea and into, well, let's get a client and move, it was, and in some cases certainly remains, very tricky. So it's the typical thing. I realized very quickly I had to have a local partner to do this, or it was just not going to be possible. My Chinese is not bad, but it's我的听力比我的口语好。
Yeah, okay.
So it's the guanxi and that reserve of 人性, these relationships that you need to get things going. And absolutely, it's friends and family, it's ex-colleagues, it's classmates. These were our sales. This is what got us going. And really, in some ways, it's a great shame, because it requires that level of trust, and somehow there's going to be some payback in the relationship to take on what is an assessment or a process or new competencies that are on face value and through evidence worthwhile having anyway. They shouldn't require a relationship to get you over that decision point, and yet that's how it was. And in some cases, it still is.
Yes.
Which professionally is, to me, very sad. And yet, ignore the human factor at one's peril. We are not necessarily pure logically, driven in our decision making. It is bias, risk aversion, and keeping us in a nice comfort zone that could be economic, social, political, you name it. So definitely, the way that we went in was through a local partner, and then, and again, for myself, calling in my relationships, limited as they were then, to get things going.
I mean, I kind of, sorry, it resonates with me about the way the Chinese approach personality, because I went up work before to Shanghai, and people were talking about their horoscope, the animal type, which is bemusing to me, because here we are living in 21st century where science is supposed to be able to educate people, but people who are senior level are willing to take a chance on that and believe in a lot of myth and folklore. But as practitioners like ourselves, I think it is our responsibility, I guess, to educate people as much as we can, and show them what are the valid tools in the market. And of course, one of the next thing I want to ask is, in what we do, we are always faced with a lot of psychometric tools. For us, we could discern the good and the bad. How would you actually advise maybe the listeners of this podcast, or even in general HR practitioners, to differentiate what is a good and what is a bad psychometric tool?
Of course, it's a great question, Austin. I think, I mean, that a typical business person who's got a responsibility or an interest in hiring the best talent that they can hire, the people who will have the best impact on their company. And when we talk about impact, we don't think about performance, which is the typical single perspective people think about. That's not actually the impact that a person has on your company. They have, when a person comes in through that door, virtually now.
Yes, virtually now.
You get the whole person, the good and the bad, on a good day and a bad day. And that's what you get. You get performance, that task performance, and that what was often talked about, the contextual performance, which is really now falls into that engagement area. If they're happy in the job, they'll do more for you, they'll help more people, they'll connect, they'll have more ideas, they'll share more of those organizational citizenship behaviors. They'll stay longer because they're happy to be there. This performance and engagement is what you get, and this is really important. And you also get a third thing, which is their dark side, which is these potential for counterproductive behaviors, which on a bad day in the wrong situation are triggered because it's part of the person too, but you might not see because they will never reveal those things to you because it's not in their interest when they're applying for a job. So when we're thinking about a good psychometric test, I don't think I suspect that a business owner doesn't think about a psychometric test. They just think about trying to hire a good person. And what if I get this person to do this, or I ask them to run through this exercise or something, what will I learn? And will I trust the results? And this is the challenge, is when we just talked about belief. If somebody just does not believe, and that's based upon, it could be rooted in DNA, but most likely in childhood experience or life experience, and somehow projecting themselves into their own weakness or fallacy, or a concern about their own limitations, that to accept that this might be true would be a threat to them. That's fundamentally where I come. When somebody says, I don't believe, that's because you're trying to protect something through that belief, which is obviously, from our point of view and science point of view, it's not valid. But it is to them. It's real. So really, from our point of view, from the psychometric point of view, the science point of view, it's very simple. We have reliability, we have validity, we have in applied situations, we have differentiation. And that's how you evaluate a tool. Is it Does it measure what it's supposed to measure? Does it measure it accurately? Is anybody in engaging with that tool or process, is anybody harmed or treated unfairly? If the answer to those things are all good in the positive, then great, use the tool. As long as then you can afford to do so, and it fits with everything else that you're doing in the picture. So the science-wise, it's easy for us to do. Does it fit the context? Does it measure what I want? Can I afford it? Can I learn it? What's the costs and rewards of doing it? From the client side, from a business owner side, it's much more simpler than that, because what clients tend to look at is the report. They don't read a technical manual. They don't look at the psychometrics and the science and even the theory. They look at the report, and if on face value, that pure face validity, can I understand what this thing is telling me? Does that make sense with myself and with my experience of people? Can I find some sort of evidence that fires up in my mind to say, oh yeah, look at that. That's true. Somehow that just triggers that affirmative sense of control, that affirmative sense of even power, that, oh yeah, now I can see inside these people. Now I have more power over this thing. That sense of certainty, that's actually what to a client makes a good psychometric tool. It's not actually a psychometric. Does the results match what I think they should be, that makes me feel more confident in my decision making? Whether that confidence lines up with the actual psychometric qualities really are two different universes. And the simple example is people who use tools that are very good in development contexts. We discussed these before. I think DISC and MBTI are the classic global examples, two very fabulously useful structures to think about people and communication, and yet psychometrically flawed or very challenged by a large amount of people outside of those actual people who are actually involved in developing those tools. And I think that's really where it lies. People can use the MBTI for selection and believe in it and will like it and give you 1,000 examples of why it's great. Yep. And yet psychometrically, we know it's not actually helping their decision quality at all. In fact, legally, it's not defensible.
Yes.
That's a bit of a wander around it, but hopefully that
yeah, it does. I mean, I'm with you in terms. I mean, we had this discussion before about typology and traits. I'm definitely not a fan of a 4-letter psychometric tool, because it's so limited in terms of scope, in terms of trying to tell people. And I respect people who believe in that, and respect people who thinks those tools could help them in whatever they want to do. But as a scientist like ourselves, we as practitioners also, we know the science behind it, and it's where we start to educate people about relevant tools in the market. I mean, we have, both of us combined, we've seen many tools in the market, and we know which are the ones that we should avoid using it, and or perhaps also encourage our clients not to use it because of the scientific technical manuals that we read and the evidence that we have on the tools itself. And I think it's very important to look at tools, the function of it, and why is the tool designed or developed in the first place. And for people who are choosing it, though it's boring, they still need to understand what is reliable and what is actually valid. Because if it doesn't do that, then it doesn't serve the purpose of why they want to choose a psychometric tool in the first place. And I think both of us would have seen a lot of clients wanting to do it because everybody else is doing it, therefore we want to jump on the bandwagon to use a psychometric tool because it's the hip thing to do, and therefore we want to do it. But they have no sense of what is good and bad out in the market. And I think it is important to be able to educate consumers, because a caveat there is you can use any tool, anybody can come up with a tool. It's a matter of whether it's going to be, as you said, legally challenged or in a sense be helpful. And I think that kind of brings very well to my next question to you, really. James. Now, I know that your organization, your company has this psychometric tool called TD12. Tell us a
Yes.
little bit more about what this psychometric tool is and what's the difference with this and the tools in the market.
Yeah, delighted. The TD12 is one of a small group of psychometrics that looks to give insights into the dark side of personality. It's the research on the dark side of personality is actually it grows out of the clinical psychology, of course, and so when we're looking at DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Dysfunctions and Disorders, that clinical psychology research is massive. It is very long term in its history, and it was in the 90s and early 2000s that the question was asked when looking at personality disorders, how and the difficulty of measuring them, because it requires a specialist, as you well know, to actually evaluate a disorder. How prevalent are they in normal people? If we could actually measure it a bit faster than having to sit through a long interview with a highly trained clinician, how prevalent are these disorders in the normal population? And so various research, it starts to pop up that, well, it's probably if we sat down and we did our clinical interviews of a broad sample of the working population, you might find 10 to 15% of people would have a potentially clinical diagnosis of one of many personality disorders, of which there are about 10, 11, depending upon the version of the DSM that they use to classify them. And it was this finding that comes out and saying, well, if that's the case and we're hiring these people, what's happening? They're not obviously clinically problematic, and yet they are extreme in some of the traits that there would be, the behaviors they would exhibit in certain times. So are these people, the psychopaths hiding in plain sight? Is it the narcissists we've ignored? What are they doing to our companies if this is the case? And this is where the research into the dark side of personality in normal populations started to become. So the TD12 is based upon that clinical heritage, but then it evolves from that into like a normal trait questionnaire as the way to measure it. So it takes some of the behaviors that are linked to personality disorders, but then puts them into a context of a normal working person to evaluate. And in the same way as most trait psychometrics, what we're looking for is to understand through comparison with typical behaviors how extreme a person is likely to be. And simply put, the more extreme a person is compared to other people on these sorts of dark traits, then the more we should be worried about them and the potential impact that they might have on our companies or the people working in our companies or on themselves in terms of performance or engagement or just a whole range of problematic behaviors.
Okay. You mentioned about this too. I remember when we were talking about this too itself, you say it is actually an existing tool that you actually adapted for the market in China. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, it was developed in 2006 in Paris by two professors there, Jean-Pierre Roland and Professor Pichot, at the University of Paris, and with the Pearson assessments had supported them and helped in that development. And so we had taken it, become a publisher for them in China and Asia Pacific, and we developed it in about 2009 to 2011. So all the research and development validation we did to create a Chinese version for the mainland China. And that process then, the validation process was absolutely fascinating because we got to look at military populations, medical populations, academic populations, the teachers. Actually, all these areas are high risk. If people in those jobs have problems, problematic behavior, it can really have a serious negative impact for the people or resources that they care for. So that was fascinating. And we got to do research in mental health and even got into criminal populations. So we're looking at the prevalence of these traits in people who were in jail, who had been accused of or found guilty of violent or non-violent crime. And our findings tailored very much with the international research on prison populations. So if you go to a prison population and you test them for these sorts of traits, of which the TD12 looks at 12 traits, you are highly likely to find in white-collar crime, these are business leaders who have committed fraud or theft from companies, obviously the companies who hired them, then they're typically going to be high on traits related to narcissism or antisocial personality. And it's absolutely fascinating because to me, there was a survey done years back by PwC on global economic crime. And they come up with a stat that basically 1 in 3 companies are hit by some sort of economic crime. And of those, 4 out of 5, 80% of those cases are inside jobs. People who are hired by HR to perform well for the company, they ended up committing such level of crime that they were actually found and put in jail for it. It's extraordinary. These things are real, and it's high level and low level. So the lowest level of things that we're trying to help companies identify the risk of and control the risk of. Remember, we're still talking about normal people here. We're not talking about criminals or clinical people. It's just a normal part of actually hiring somebody, because the dark personalities, dark traits are part of all of us. You, me, we've all got them. The question is, in what situations may they be triggered, and what's the likely risk to the company and the people in the company if I have that bad day, or if that trait starts to become prevalent? Because often those traits are actually really useful. And narcissism in a business leader is actually linked with performance to a degree. But typically too much for too long in the wrong time, that's when problems start. The same with antisocial stuff. It may be some sort of antisocial trait might drive people through problems and obstacles, and they just push. So sometimes hugely effective and sometimes appallingly ineffective. And this is really where the TD12 comes into it. It's trying to give that insight based on the research into some of the extremes. But then we normalize that and just say, well, let's have a look at the risk of this person, of hiring this person. What would they bring to you? Rather than what HR and even org psychs tend to spend most of our time is this optimistic look at how well they're going to perform, how nice it will be to work with this person. It's a very optimistic view because we're looking for somebody to fill that seat. To find the dark traits of somebody is actually very difficult to do because it doesn't come up in interview. It's the last thing you'll find. It's very hard to get through any other means except through a specialist interview or review in depth of their background, which is expensive and difficult to do without a specialist. But these trait questionnaires like the TD12 that are designed for selection, not just for development, really gets you this insight that is almost impossible to get in any other way. Equally, as we all know from the use of any psychometric, it's only a version of the truth as it's self-report. So although it's very difficult actually to fake these, to manipulate them without being seen to be manipulative. The people who try to manipulate them tend to have dark traits.
Yes. Yes.
And they don't actually realize what normal is. It's very difficult to fake these sorts of specialist questionnaires. But the insights are fabulous when you combine them with other information. Then the interview that you can have, if you're trained in obviously that what personality and traits and talent is, then that interview is extraordinarily insightful, and it can help you properly evaluate the risks that you're.
It's amazing to hear how much sample or population you actually use to do for validation study itself. Now, two questions really. First question is, we both know that there is probably another person who's actually looking at dark traits in terms of the psychometric tool in the market itself. What's the difference between TD12 and that particular one? And the second thing is, with all this population that you have actually surveyed, those are very, very good data points. You mentioned that you have the publisher right for Asia Pac. Now, you have done that in China. Where else are you doing validation studies, and what kind of validation studies are you doing in terms of TD12 perhaps in Malaysia, where you are now?
Yeah, thanks. The actual back in that, so the 90s, when the dark side research was starting, it really started from Bob and Joyce Hogan, of Hogan Assessments. And they're just absolutely, their work was fabulous, and it remains fabulous, frankly. So Hogan developed, they have 3 tools in their main battery, if you like, looking around personality. One is normal personality traits, bright side personality, sometimes talked of, which is a typical Big Five related tool. They have a motivations evaluation, again, so looking at that motivational and values aspect of personality. And they have a dark side tool, the Hogan Development Survey. They use these 3 things together primarily in development work. And the HDS, although it in the technical manual, Bob Hogan said in the early days of it, oh yes, this can be used for selection. Fundamentally, they never used it for that, and it was never designed for it, even in its the way that they would measure it in a questionnaire. It's very easily faked at that time. They've just changed their response scales just 2 years ago, I think, or even last year. They changed their response scales to improve the reliability and to make it a little bit more rigorous, so it could be used better in selection. But it's fundamentally for the whole of its, and again, with respect to Hogan, I'm sure they've got other insights too. It's fundamentally been very useful and powerful and shaped for development. The TD12 is not that. The TD12 was designed for use in the much more difficult measurement environment of selection. And secondly, for development rather than the other way around. And of course, as we know, selection and development really are in self-expression. When you're relying on the self-awareness and truthfulness of a candidate or of an individual, what a candidate will share and how they'll share it, and what the individual on a training course will share are 完全不一样.
Yes.
They are different. In the TD12 itself, in our early research, they were different by up to a standard deviation, measurement-wise, which puts you in a completely different measurement paradigm. So the TD12 really, the biggest difference is designed for selection. It's very hard to fake. it's designed to do the harder yards in selection. And in fact, the weakness of TD12 in some ways is that it's not been designed, particularly developed for development. There isn't a pure development report, funnily enough, for the TD12. The focus has been so much on selection. But the good news is that's coming as well. So that's just an evolution. I think it's easier to go from selection into development rather than development into selection because the environments are different. A much more hostile measurement environment. They also, I mean, there's minor differences in how they do their measurements that support both sort of approaches. And the TD12 actually does measure an additional factor that the Hogan assessment doesn't. But they fundamentally, they're derived from the same clinical framework of the DSM and personality disorders. They approach them in slightly different ways. They pick up slightly different parts of the traits. Of course, that's important in the definitions of what's trying to be measured. And the TD12 really, I think, deals with them in a more hard-nosed way. We accept that these are potentially problematic, and we don't have to gloss over those problems. In the development way, the phrases, the terms in the Hogan tool are much more gentle. And they're designed in some ways not to frighten the individuals who will read the reports. And you don't want to make them overly defensive of these things that are often very deep-seated defense mechanisms.
Yes.
So it's very different audiences for different purposes. And I think that's the main difference, other than slight measurement differences, and the TD12 measures an additional factor. So hopefully that's the difference.
That's great. I mean, to explain that the differences for the listeners and for people who are going to be choosing one tool over another, I think if you're using a selection, it's good to actually look at a tool that will help them to do that first. And as you just say, TD12 itself will be able to review those dark traits. And I think that will be very helpful for organization when they are looking to employ someone who might have certain skills that are a little bit high, and to look at if they're going to employ this person, how they can train this individual person. We are not saying that this is a way that you kind of sift through your applicants and say, oh, this person has this particular high score on maybe a narcissism trait, therefore we do not want them. I think it's very individual and circumspect to what the organization needs. Sometimes you do need someone who's a little bit high on a certain dark trait because of the nature of the work. And I think this has to be clear to people listening to here. We are not talking about if you find someone who has a dark trait, please do not employ them. I think it is very individual to the organization needs and wants. And I think that is good to clarify.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. It is one of those fundamental, psychometric point or psych points of doing assessments that there's no, ultimately, these are all normal people. And they're all perfectly capable of, if they're in front of you, if they've applied, then they've succeeded in society as society expects them to do so. And that's really important. This is additional information that's incredibly useful for you. But the decision is really like any decision for hiring. You're managing, you're trying to make a prediction of likelihood. What's the likelihood that the person's going to perform well, enjoy working with you, and not become too much of a problem if things go bad or wrong or on a bad day? That's what you're trying to do. And compared to other people, it's actually a very complex decision people have to make when you're comparing. And by getting actual data, statistical, quantifiable data that allows you to compare and look at and raise your awareness of potential issues, allows you to look at those things. What's interesting about it, just how this additional insight helps, even if you're using a normal personality tool already, how the additional insight helps. One of the validation studies we did for a large pharmaceutical company in Shanghai was particularly interesting because they decided to just use the TD12 for people who they decided to already offer a job to. So right at the end, they'd done their assessment program, CV and other screening tools and interviews and so on. And basically they got to the point, here are the people we want to actually offer a job to. Now let's do the TD12, which of course is never the way you want to do it.
No.
But it's the way they wanted to do it because they just wanted to see what would happen. And if the information, when they reviewed it in depth, any alert that was raised, and through those conversations and research that would follow, whether they would keep the same hiring decision or not. And it was really interesting. So there were 137 cases where they'd gone to hiring, and then HR had been trained in the TD12, and so we weren't involved in the process at all, not our team. And HR would then look at the profile, and they decide, this is interesting. This person's trait on, for example, again, we talk about narcissism. Again, there are other higher narcissism sorts of traits, or a little bit antisocial, or they're perhaps avoidant of responsibility, or they're very dependent on other people to make decisions for them. There's lots of these interesting traits that they're out there. Even traits of, they tend to have rather strange ideas about things that are real or not real. This is another sort of a more cognitive sort of disorder. The HR would look at it, and if they felt, when they're looking at the other information they got on the person, there was a case to be concerned, given the nature of the job they're going to do and the way they might be able to control or manage or help this person, they're trying to think about this. Can we control this threat? Then they would decide to have a session with the hiring team, including the line manager, and they'd have to decide on the research to go back again, what to do, and whether to proceed or not. And at the end of the day, and you can imagine this meets with big resistance, because the hiring manager thinks, great, I'm going to fill my seat. And then HR is going, rethink, relook, review, hang on. Let's just think again, based upon this new information that's just come in. They stopped 1 in 10 hiring decisions. This is extraordinary. So literally it's saying, if I show you this information that you don't know yet, what's the likelihood that you, the hiring team, will change your mind? 1 in 10. So that's 1 in 10 hiring decisions. So literally that's, in theory, an improvement in your hiring quality decision, the quality of hiring quality decisions. It's just fantastic. So it's very powerful information that comes with it. Of course, once they've done that study and they're all convinced, then they stop that, and it becomes part of the normal process. Yes. Because it's very disruptive. But it does show that the power of insight. But as you were saying, and very important to stress again, in their cases, and again, a good example of their cases, some of the applicants are highly technically skilled, and they have very few applicants for a position because the skills, knowledge, experience is specific. There are few candidates. And so it's almost like, well, this is the only person we've got who's applied. And it suggests that they're quite passive aggressive. And we've explored their passive aggressive tendencies. We now realize that they do these things. But what do? Do we just not hire them because they tend to be passive aggressive to people they don't like, or they disagree with them, or who give them too much work, or on a Monday? But at least we know the nature of their passive aggressive behaviors. So now the question is not, like you said, they're just high, therefore smile about, we don't hire them. No, this person has a great deal to offer us if we can control the risk. If it's worth, the costs of controlling the risks are worth it. The rewards that we get by accepting the person as they are, as long as we can manage or control it, and ideally with that person's knowledge and awareness, then you may be into a good position. No problem. You're human. You come good and bad. We accept that. We can work with you. We're all good. We're controlled. Come and join us, you passive aggressive person.
Yeah, I mean, it fits for the job. I think it is important to stress that, as you said, because I have seen a lot of organization when they get me to do selection work for them. The first thing they will ask me is this person the best person for the job? I said, well, I can't actually tell you that, but I can present to you the evidence. And then you look at the job itself. A lot of time I do that kind of matching it based on the job, but I'll write the report and I'll feedback to the client itself and say, based on what I see for this job, do you have any, as what you said, ability to mitigate those risks or help this individual to develop? While you take this person in, you need to be aware there are certain things they are not good at, or they might exhibit certain things. How do you mitigate that? And I think that's where the work environment, the culture of an organization is also equally important. A lot of times organizations they always say, oh, we have a fantastic culture. But then when they get someone who actually doesn't fit their culture, they start to go, well, I'm not going to have this person. And I think it speaks volumes of how people are actually practicing what they preach. If it's going to be a fair assessment or a selection process, this has to be conveyed to the individual. And I think one of the things that is still contentious to a lot of organizations is, should we provide a feedback to applicants? If they don't join us, do we do a feedback to them? I think a lot of people have different views on that. I personally, if I get an opportunity, I usually tell them what it is, according to this job. And it's very job focused, job specific, and not anything to do with the individual. I pick certain things up from it and then go on a tandem and say, this is why you fail in the whole selection. I think this has to be also ingrained in our HR and our organization. The processes is very, very important. It's not just taking one piece of information and then ignore everything else, and that person is not fairly judged or selected. And I think this is important when we talk about psychometric tools and how we use them for the right purpose, and not just use it because everybody else is using it, or maybe the psychometric tool is very colorful or it's cheap, therefore I want to use it. I think these are the things that organization or HR who are using psychometric tools have to remember. Why are we using it in the first place, and apply it accordingly? I think that's very, very important.
I completely agree. I do agree. There's some very interesting, psychological ideas around people's relationship with psychometrics, and not just psychometrics, with just understanding other human beings in a systematic way. I do find there are many psychologically constructed obstructions for HR and managers to embrace a systematic, fair way, respectful process of trying to understand and match talent to their opportunity and their culture. I actually don't fully understand why there is the level of professionalism in something that's so critical to organizations. That the level of professionalism, and I say that in terms of what people know, what people have been trained in, how much they invest in, is still so relatively low compared to many other aspects of an organization. If we look at manufacturing process controls, engineering, financial controls and systems, legal operations management, incredible levels of specialization and professionalism you will find. But when we come to talent assessment, the evaluation of a human being's capability and potential to fit with the super complex and changing environment of our work and our job, while that human is changing, we seem so comfortable still dropping into belief and brand and shiny things and what others are doing, rather than actually having a systematic, well-educated approach to doing that essential thing.
Yep.
And maybe that's ultimately what in the back of my mind too drove us into the psychometric area. It's not just psychometrics, which is the tools. It is, I think, that approach and valuing of people. That the decision that people, the HR and managers, hiring managers have to make is an incredibly complex decision. You are dealing with chaos, the chaos of a person who's incredibly complex, in an organization that's complex, in an environment that's complex, and all three systems are changing. And to do that in an unsystematic way is perhaps a a surrendering, like it's too complicated. There's no answer, so it doesn't matter. We'll just work on the actual failure rates we have, and if we can manage those failure rates, then it doesn't matter.
Yes.
If some people come, we fire them. Swallow about, we just hire somebody else.
Yeah.
That's the only failure they have to deal with. And funnily enough, as you know, in many even large companies, turnover and performance are still not properly measured. So if turnover and performance are actually the consequences of a bad hiring decision, and we don't worry about measuring those things really clearly, then perhaps that illustrates why the hiring decision is not ever held accountable, because we don't want to. It's not that we can't measure turnover and performance, is that systematically across organizations around the world, even at 2020, it's still not done half as well as any first-year org psych student would recommend.
Yeah, so I guess we have a lot of work to do there. As outside, we need to go and talk to people more and open sessions where we educate people actually, and why we need to assess individual more appropriately. Yes. And not just be kind of piecemeal with the things that we do. And I totally agree with you, the way how organizations are looking at turnover, performance management, what have you, not doing very well itself. And I always find it very funny when someone is about to leave, then there is an exit interview. I always find those redundant because the damage has been done. If you could have do something about it, this person is not going to sit there with you having an exit interview. I was saying so. I mean, that is definitely another bigger topic that we could talk about in another time. I'm just wondering, in terms of the question I was asking, what other validation studies are you doing, especially now that you're in this part of Asia, south side of Asia, and are you working with anybody in terms of doing more validation studies for TD?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. I really appreciate that as well, because we've had. The TD12 is professionally the most interesting tool that I've had the pleasure of working with, in terms of course, its psychometric properties and the insights you get. It is so interesting view inside the workings of people's minds, and helps in predicting their potential futures. We are looking beyond mainland China, which is great. So we're actually working now with a team from the University of the Philippines. We've just completed the Filipino version of it's the initial adaptation of it. So the validation is going to begin actually next week, because it'll be on.
Oh, brilliant.
So that's been great. We had a team of sort of 5 psychologists work with us there to do that. We are also working with the University of Reading, which I'm delighted to say, yes, as Professor Kylie Chung, who heads the deliberate psychology area there, is a specialist in criminology. And so she's very interested in forensic psychology and these aspects of dark personality. So she's going to be leading that adaptation as well. That's starting now. And we're also looking to develop a more focused version for southern China, actually, Hong Kong, Macau area, Guangzhou, if you like, through a collaboration with a professor in Macau as well. So that's just coming to fruition. We're really looking for anybody who either has an organizational psychology background from a org psych consulting company, or a university professionals or just again independent researchers who would be interested to research dark personality for use in organizations in their country. There is no doubt that, as we know, that for any psychometric tool, it must be contextually relevant. The measurement must be seen through the local culture and via obviously that language component. And so it's critical that we do, for something that's so sensitive and so important, that we we research it fully, so that there is a good scientific basis that can guide practitioners and give them the confidence that, yeah, this is meaningful, it's real. Again, it's a very good reference point that companies can use when they're evaluating the potential impact of an employee. And equally, I should say, again, it is for development as well. So we're looking at these factors are involved in the derailment of people. Typically, it's talked of in terms of leadership. Whereas people grow through their organization over a period of 10, 15 years, they grow and change. And those traits that may have helped them succeed may become a problem at higher levels of leadership. And so to make them aware of these potential dark traits for themselves can be incredibly liberating and a powerful thing for them to stop their career from going off track. So again, that research is essential too. So we are looking for anybody out there in podcast land to help us with that.
Sure, I'm sure some of the listeners to this podcast will be interested. What I'm going to do is to perhaps leave your contact details in the show notes so that people who are interested to collaborate with you will be able to contact you directly.
It's really kind. Thank you.
Yeah, you're my pleasure. Well, it has been fantastic talking to you. I mean, I've learned so much from what you've been doing, what you have done and what you're continuing to doing in terms of the TD12. I'm sure we are going to have lots of questions from our listeners, and hopefully they will be able to help you in kind of developing this psychometric tool wider, and everybody else in the region could actually use this. And who knows, might be actually applicable somewhere else beyond Asia.
Absolutely. Actually, fortunately, there are European versions and so on. And of course, the English version is available as well. So it all that creates a bigger scientific reference points for us all as we apply them locally. But applying it locally is key. But based upon global knowledge is what the world's all about these days. So that's great.
Yes, especially so now where everybody is kind of connected, remotely and what have you. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me, James, and we hope to perhaps have another opportunity to talk to you again.
Absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Austin.
Thank you. No problem. My pleasure.